What happens when a simple journey becomes a life-or-death decision? On an ordinary afternoon, a young woman named Elizabeth spotted something that made her heart stop. A motionless dog lying by the side of the road, covered in wounds and barely breathing. While hundreds of cars had passed by that same spot, something made her stop. The injured golden retriever puppy looked at her with eyes that expressed pain and a spark of hope. Elizabeth faced a choice that would change two lives forever. What she discovered about this puppy's condition would shock even the veterinarians, and the journey ahead would test her resolve in ways she never imagined.
Elizabeth was driving home after a long day at work when something unusual caught her eye. At the side of the road, between the tall grass and the hot asphalt, a golden blur moved slightly. Her immediate instinct was to keep driving. After all, it was late and she needed to rest. But something stronger made her slow down and look again in her rearview mirror. As she stopped the car and walked toward that spot, Elizabeth felt a pang in her chest. It was a golden retriever puppy, no bigger than a pillow, lying on its side with half-closed eyes. Its golden fur was stained with dried blood and dirt, and open wounds marked its paws and back. The animal was breathing with difficulty, each breath seeming to require immense effort. Elizabeth knelt beside it, and the puppy made a weak movement with its tail, as if recognizing that someone had finally stopped. At that moment, Elizabeth realized she couldn't just call someone and leave. That little creature was fighting for its life, and every second counted. She took a blanket from the trunk, wrapped the puppy carefully so as not to hurt it further, and placed it in the back seat. As she drove at high speed looking for a veterinary clinic, she glanced in the mirror and saw the puppy's eyes fixed on her, as if it knew that its only chance of survival was in the hands of that stranger who had decided to stop.
The race against time seemed endless. Elizabeth called 3 veterinary clinics before finding one that was still open at that hour. The receptionist, upon hearing the description of the puppy's condition, asked her to come immediately. During the 15-minute drive, Elizabeth couldn't stop looking back, checking if the little golden retriever was still breathing. With each red light, her desperation grew. When she finally arrived at the clinic, 2 veterinarians were already waiting at the door. They urgently took the puppy and rushed it straight to the emergency room. Elizabeth stayed in the reception area, her hands trembling and stained with blood. The receptionist offered her water and a place to sit, but she could barely stand still. 40 minutes passed as if they were hours. Every noise coming from the hallway made her heart race, imagining the worst. Finally, the door opened, and the head veterinarian, Dr. Marcos, emerged with a serious expression. He explained that the puppy had suffered multiple injuries, likely caused by being hit by a car. There were fractures in his hind legs, severe dehydration, and an infection beginning to spread from the open wounds. Most alarming was that the puppy had been in that state for at least 2 days, fighting for his life alone. Dr. Marcos looked Elizabeth in the eyes and said something she would never forget. "A few more hours, and we wouldn't have been able to save him. You arrived at the exact right moment."
Elizabeth felt her legs weaken as she listened to those words. The veterinarian went on to explain that the puppy would need to spend the night at the clinic under constant observation. Intravenous antibiotics, specialized dressings, and possibly surgery to correct the fractures in its paws would be necessary. The costs would be high, and there were no guarantees of a full recovery. Dr. Marcos asked if she was the owner of the animal, and Elizabeth hesitated before replying that she had just found it on the road. The silence that followed was heavy. The receptionist looked at the computer, clearly waiting for a decision on how to proceed. Elizabeth could simply leave the puppy there, report the case to the local authorities, and walk away. No one would judge her for it. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see were those brown eyes of the puppy looking at her in the back seat of the car, trusting that she would save him. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth opened her purse and took out her credit card. "Do whatever is necessary," she said in a firm voice.
Dr. Marcos nodded respectfully and explained that he would call during the night if there were any changes. Elizabeth asked to see the puppy one last time before leaving. In the treatment room, he lay on a heated stretcher, connected to IV fluids and with clean bandages covering his wounds. She gently touched his head, and even sedated, he slightly moved his ear. At that moment, Elizabeth knew she had made the right decision, regardless of what lay ahead.
The night was the longest Elizabeth had ever experienced. She arrived home exhausted but unable to sleep. Every time her phone made any sound, she jumped up to check if it was the clinic calling. At 3 in the morning, she finally received a message from Dr. Marcos informing her that the puppy had stabilized and was responding well to the medication. Elizabeth felt immense relief wash over her and finally managed to fall asleep for a few hours. The following morning, she woke up early and went straight to the clinic. Upon entering the recovery room, she was surprised by what she saw. The puppy was awake, still weak, but his eyes had a different gleam. When he saw her, his tail began to wag slowly, gently tapping against the blanket. Dr. Marcos explained that the surgery on his paws had been a success and that now the most important phase began: recovery. It would be weeks of intensive care, physiotherapy, and lots of love. Elizabeth spent more than an hour sitting beside him, stroking his head and talking softly. She realized she needed to give him a name. Observing that little creature who had fought so hard for his life, she thought of something that represented strength and a new beginning. "Cooper," she whispered. The puppy turned his head toward her, as if approving of the choice. From that moment on, Cooper was no longer just an abandoned puppy on the road. He had a name, he had someone who cared, and he had a real chance to live. 3 days later, it was time for Cooper to leave the clinic. Elizabeth had prepared her home to welcome the new resident. She bought a soft bed, water and food bowls, appropriate toys, and all the medications prescribed by the veterinarian. Dr. Marcos gave her a detailed care list. Cooper would need to take antibiotics 3 times a day, have his dressings changed every 12 hours, and avoid any sudden movements until his paws had fully recovered. The drive back home was completely different from that desperate race the first night. Cooper was wrapped in a clean blanket, propped up in a special transport crate. Elizabeth drove slowly, avoiding potholes and hard braking. In the rear-view mirror, she saw Cooper observing everything out the window with curiosity, as if he were discovering the world for the first time. It was hard to believe that this same puppy had been almost lifeless just a few days before. When they arrived home, Elizabeth carefully carried him into the living room and placed him in his new bed. Cooper sniffed everything around him, exploring his new territory with slow, cautious movements. When Elizabeth sat on the floor beside him, Cooper crawled into her lap and rested his head on her leg. She felt tears stream down her face, not from sadness, but from a deep emotion she couldn't name. In that instant, Elizabeth understood that she hadn't just saved Cooper. In some inexplicable way, he was also saving something inside her.
The first few weeks were challenging in ways Elizabeth never imagined. Cooper needed constant care, and she completely reorganized her routine to meet his needs. She woke up earlier to administer his medication before work, returned home at lunchtime to change his dressings, and spent her nights monitoring for any signs of discomfort or pain. There were moments of exhaustion when she wondered if she could keep up that pace. But with each small victory, her determination was renewed. On the 10th day, Cooper managed to stand on his own for the first time, even if only for a few seconds. Elizabeth celebrated as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. 2 weeks later, he took his first unsteady steps around the room, his paws still fragile but gaining strength each day. Dr. Marcos was impressed by the speed of his recovery during follow-up appointments. attributing the progress not only to the medical treatment, but also to the loving and secure environment Elizabeth had created. Cooper's physical transformation was remarkable, but something even deeper was happening. The puppy who had previously barely been able to lift his head now ran around the house with increasing energy. His wounds were healing well, leaving only a few discreet marks under his golden fur, which was regaining its shine. But what was most impressive was the confidence Cooper was developing each day. He, who had been abandoned and injured, now followed Elizabeth everywhere, his paws making a rhythmic sound on the floor, as if he feared losing sight of her.
2 months after the rescue, Cooper was unrecognizable. The fractures had healed perfectly, and he ran around the yard with the agility typical of a healthy golden retriever. His golden fur shone in the sun, and only someone looking very closely would notice the small scars that told the story of his survival. Elizabeth watched these transformations with a mixture of pride and admiration, remembering the broken puppies she had found on that road. Their routine had naturally formed. Every morning, Cooper would wake Elizabeth with enthusiastic licks, eager for their morning walk, which had become their favorite time together. During the day, while Elizabeth worked around the house, Cooper would rest at her feet, occasionally bringing his favorite ball in hopes of a brief play session. Evenings were reserved for basic obedience training, where Cooper demonstrated surprising intelligence, learning commands with impressive ease. But what touched Elizabeth most was the way Cooper looked at her. It wasn't just the look of a dog for its owner. There was something deeper there. It was gratitude, loyalty, and an unconditional love she had never experienced before. Friends and family commented on the special connection between the two, as if they could communicate without words. Elizabeth knew that this bond had been forged in those critical moments, when she chose to stop and he chose to trust. Together, they had overcome the impossible.
6 months had passed since that afternoon that changed everything. Elizabeth decided to return to the exact spot where she had found Cooper, something she had been putting off for weeks. She needed to close that circle, revisit the place where it all began. Cooper was beside her in the passenger seat, observing the landscape through the window with his characteristic curiosity. When they reached the point on the road, Elizabeth parked and got out of the car with Cooper on a leash. The place looked completely different now. The tall grass swayed gently in the wind, and the afternoon sun illuminated the asphalt in an almost poetic way. Elizabeth looked at the exact spot where she had seen that still, golden shape, and a shiver ran down her spine. Cooper sniffed the ground, obviously not recognizing the place of his past suffering. He was more interested in chasing a butterfly that flew by. Elizabeth smiled at the scene, noticing the stark contrast between the dying puppy of that day and the vibrant dog that now explored the surroundings with joy. While they stood there, several cars sped past, their drivers likely preoccupied with their commitments and worries. Elizabeth wondered how many other animals in need of help people passed by every day without noticing, or worse, noticing, but choosing not to stop. She looked at Cooper, who now sat beside her, gazing at her with those bright brown eyes, and felt immense gratitude for having made the decision to stop. That moment of compassion had not only saved a life, but had enriched her own in ways she could never have foreseen.
The story of Elizabeth and Cooper became a powerful testament to the impact of a single act of kindness. What began as a spontaneous decision to stop the car transformed into a journey of mutual healing. Cooper not only regained his physical health, but found a loving home where he would never again know abandonment or suffering. Elizabeth, in turn, discovered loyal companionship and a renewed purpose that brought unexpected joy to her days. Today, Cooper is a healthy adult golden retriever, free from any of the limitations left by the injuries that nearly took his life. He accompanies Elizabeth on all her adventures, from walks in the park to quiet afternoons at home. The scars beneath his golden fur are merely silent reminders of his resilience and the second chance he received. Elizabeth often shares Cooper's story with others, inspiring people not to ignore animals in distress. She has learned that being in the right place at the right time can mean the difference between life and death. Cooper's complete transformation proves that with proper care, patience, and unconditional love, even the most desperate situations can have happy endings. That afternoon on the road could have ended in tragedy, but the choice of one compassionate person completely rewrote that puppy's destiny. Elizabeth and Cooper now live a full life together, each day a celebration of the decision she made to simply stop and help when others passed by without looking.